were beneficial. All they knew was that they were everywhere. Everything they looked at was just teeming with these microbes, all sorts of different sizes, shapes, and so on. So it's a dramatic discovery, and building off of that, microscopes have always been kind of our gateway technology to learn more about these worlds that we can't see. And we still use even, more powerful microscopes today. It wasn't until the electron microscope in the 40s and 50s that we were able to see viruses for the first time. So if you think bacteria are small, viruses are tiny little dwarfs compared to bacteria. I mean, there are viruses that are so small that they infect bacteria. So it took the electron microscope to see such things. And then today we have even more sophisticated techniques and tools to image this invisible world. And we can learn more about what we can see. We can learn how these things divide, how these things interact with the body, and that continues to educate us, especially in the context of people who are trying to destroy these, the pathogenic creatures. But other technologies that are really important that help us advance our understanding of microbes involve genetics. Now, genetics have been around a really long time, but we haven't been able to apply a lot of that technology until very recently. In fact, I would like to consider myself still relatively young, and my PhD thesis was basically parasites amenable to genetic manipulation. That was not a thing you could do before the year 1995. And some of my work helped to change that. So we can now make genetically modified parasites and knock out genes, put in genes, and figure out how different drugs work. Genetics is a very powerful tool that puts us in position to solve a lot of the problems that microbes can cause. You might have also heard about this technique called CRISPR. You probably talked about it at some point in this group. Long story short, it's a very powerful way that we can edit genes. It's probably going to be revolutionizing genetics in the next few decades. That came from the study of bacterial immune systems. Bacteria is where CRISPR comes from, and we've adapted it to work in human cells. So that's definitely a technology that we've turned to microbes to discover and enhance. Some of the other technologies that I see as being really important involving microbes is a concept called metabolomics. And I don't know if too many people here have heard that word before. It's a relatively new technology, but what it entails, it's kind of like genomics looks at all the genes. Metabolomics looks at all the metabolic byproducts that an organism produces. So when you're talking about a single bacteria or even an entire microbiome, scientists can now determine through sophisticated biochemical equipment what all the molecules that microbiome might be making. And that's really powerful because, as you alluded to, Jill, we can do fecal transplantation in order to remodel a microbiome. But that is a really crude way to go about doing things because we really have no idea what in that mix is causing a particular effect. Metabolomics is a technology that can help get us there and make the medication more palatable, because fecal transplantation is a little tough to sell on a patient when you're talking about taking a poop pill as a treatment. It's not necessarily something you want to sign up for. But if you can figure out what those bacteria are making, on a molecular level, and you can put that into a pill, that's far more palatable, and it's going to be more specific, okay, with less side effects, less danger, and less risk. And I got two more things that this question prompted. One of the things we discussed in the book club not long ago, you might remember when Stephanie Strafty was here talking about The Perfect Predator and her personal experience with her sick husband who was affected with a drug-resistant bacterial species. They used bacteriophage therapy to save his life. And this is an old idea, it goes back 100 years, but it was kind of ridiculed and laughed at and suppressed for a very long time. But in more recent years, with the advent of superbugs, phage therapy is becoming a very serious research topic. And it may be one of our salvations in terms of medicine to fight superbugs. Phages are the viruses that can affect specific bacteria and destroy them. And we can maybe harness their power as a new technology moving forward in order to wipe out these superbug infections that are increasingly causing a lot of pain and suffering and death. The final thing is the mRNA vaccines. So no one is a stranger to that anymore. And it was one of the reasons we have been able to climb out of this epidemic, or this pandemic, in relatively short terms. Now, I know living through it, it doesn't seem like it's been short at all. But historically, this is a victory for humanity, okay? This COVID plague could have saddled us for over a decade. But with the development of those mRNA vaccines, which allowed us to travel pretty much as the metaphor went, at warp speed, to get this thing under control, okay, it was a medical marvel. It was astonishing. And moving forward, we can now possibly use that same technology to rapidly advance other vaccines, potentially for HIV, the flu, or the next coronavirus that comes along. It's going to allow us to be able to adapt far more quickly than we've ever been able to do so before. So, sorry that's a big mouthful of an answer, but those are the 4 things that came to mind.
No, Bill, that was great. I was actually going to ask you halfway through when you were talking what the translational aspects of research like that is, because a lot of times when you're doing, preclinical research, you don't really, the translational aspect is a given, that you're obviously doing this because you want it to impact public health, but it's not necessarily obvious how that's going to happen. And I think your last 2 examples very clearly outlined how we're affected, and at this very moment, we are here because of a lot of improvements in microbiology research in general. So that was great. I appreciate that answer quite a bit. So I'm actually going to do a turn and talk now that changes directions a little bit. For the context, on page 256 of chapter 10, towards the bottom of that page, Ed Yong writes, ever since the 1860s when Joseph Lister instigated sterile techniques in his hospital, cleaning regimes have helped curb the spread of pathogens. Simple measures like hand washing have undoubtedly saved countless lives. But just as we have gone overboard in taking unnecessary antibiotics or lathering ourselves in antibacterial sanitizers, we have also gone too far in cleaning our buildings, even our hospitals. And then further down, he says the sentence that I thought was really good at summarizing everything he meant to say, which is that sanitation, when taken too far, can cause diversity to collapse. So I think in the general sense I got was that Yang was arguing that humans have gone a bit overboard with how much we sanitize, how much of an emphasis there is on cleaning everything. And so my discussion question for you guys to turn and talk to each other about is, to what extent do you agree that we have in fact gone overboard as a society with sanitation? And if there are harmful effects of too much sanitization that you think need to be changed? So I'll give you guys about 10 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes to discuss, and then we'll come back and discuss together. Good. Okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, so for the live stream, we are going to discuss the question together, and you can follow along. I wonder if it's going to get too loud.
Oh, yeah, okay. I didn't know how that worked. But
yeah, so these are still on, so they can still hear us.
Okay.
So we'll do a discussion, and then we'll talk with them when they come back. And you're welcome to, obviously, when we're discussing, for you to chime in and say whatever you want to say.
Okay.
Because you're the expert, so,
so
I just have ideas. So what did you think about that passage?
This is something that I'm really quite torn on.
Yeah.
Because as someone who works with infectious disease and have studied humanity's history with infectious disease, I mean, you have to respect the germs. But I do believe there's a case to be made for going overboard and becoming so fearful that you're paralyzed to do anything else. And I think that's going to be particularly important as we emerge from the COVID, because people are going to be scared. We've had a way of life for over 2 years now where we were petrified of germs. Some people to a greater extent than others.
Yeah.
But it's going to be unusual for a lot of people to go back to normal and not have this carefree attitude that we might have had prior to the pandemic.
Yeah.
So, and I am totally sympathetic with that. But there's this concept that emerges from germophobia called the hygienic hypothesis.
Okay.
And I think this was alluded to in the book. And it's the idea that we do live in a world that is overly sanitized. Or we have, just going, crazy with sterilizing everything, sanitizing every 5 seconds and what have you. And is that a bad thing? And why would people even say that? Because let's look at the history here. It was the mid-1800s when Louis Pasteur came up with the germ theory of disease. So prior to that, all these microbes that people were looking at in microscopes, they really didn't have any alarm about them. They weren't concerned.
Yeah.
And as you might recall, there's a famous story where doctors for the longest time would not wear gloves.
Yeah.
Okay, they'd wear the same lab coat for days and days.
Yeah.
They would go straight from an autopsy to delivering a baby without any hand washing, without any disinfectant, because there was no appreciation for what germs could do and how devastating they are. There was a fellow named Semmelweis that came up with the idea that it seems crazy to us now, that doctors should wash their hands before delivering a baby. So he instituted this at his clinic, and all the maternal deaths disappeared. Okay?
Oh.
And they still didn't believe him.
Interesting.
Doctors took it as pride to work with messy hands.
Yeah.
And just hand washing was a foreign concept to them because there was no appreciation that germs could be evil.
Yeah.
Okay? They were everywhere. How could they possibly be causing us harm?
Exactly.
They're everywhere. So it took a long time. And Louis Pasteur, even in the mid-1800s, after he came up with the germ theory of disease, still took decades before people appreciated that microbes can cause disease.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just setting a timer to make sure I
that's
bring
good.
them back.
And so we have to understand those mindsets. And the life expectancy prior to the germ theory of disease was about 40, 45 years old, which again is surprising to a lot of people in this day and age, because we live to a life expectancy of in the ballpark of 75,
80,
in that area. And that's all because of the germ theory of disease. We saw an explosion in the extension of life from simple hygienic measures of washing hands with soap and water, washing fruits and vegetables, cooking food, cleaning up our public water supply. Those very simple things. So antibiotics weren't even invented yet, but those simple hygienic measures were sufficient to start increasing life expectancy by 10, 15 years. And then when antibiotics came along in the 1930s, the famous story is Alexander Fleming discovering a mold on a bacterial plate was killing the colonies of bacteria. And that gave us another 10, 15 years. Because we were now able to fight off infections with drugs. So it's a really amazing and pretty recent turn of events. And to have that mindset where, we've been figuring out that we can increase life by killing germs, so let's annihilate them all. What we fail to appreciate is that a lot of those microbes are helpful. Okay?
Correct.
And our medicines are not specific, at least not yet. Antibiotics will wipe out all the bacteria that they're susceptible to, good and bad. And what most people well, if they read the book, they'll know this, but the microbiome is populated by hundreds of different bacterial species,
Right.
trillions of bacterial cells,
Right.
and you're dramatically disrupting that ecosystem in the gut when you take a course of antibiotics. And we don't want to scare anyone from taking medicines, of course.
Yeah.
Short-term antibiotics are fine, and your microbiome will rebound to where it was shortly thereafter. But for people taking multiple antibiotics for prolonged periods of time, you can do really significant damage to the microbiome. And that's where we get into the germophobic idea.
Yeah.
Over-sanitizing can, in fact, be a problem.
Has a similar effect of
Yeah.
just killing all germs, good or bad.
So I realize I'm waffling a bit here.
No, you're
but
making total sense.
It's because I think the answer is a balance.
Right.
We do need to be mindful and respectful of germs. They can make you very sick. They can kill.
Yeah.
But we also need to be mindful that the current medicines we have destroy a lot of helpful microbes as well.
Yeah.
And the second big problem is when we use these medications, these antibiotics, they get into our environment. A lot of people, dispense of the medication improperly,
I see.
or they take antibiotics they're not supposed to. Doctors give them out when they're not warranted.
Yeah.
If you go sample sewage and water systems, you will find our antibiotics out there in the wild.
Oh.
And you know what they're doing. They're creating an opportunity for microbes to become resistant before they even infect people.
Oh.
So we're setting up an environment where we're generating superbugs without even having patience,
Yeah.
because the antibiotics are out there in nature now.
That is an angle I
abundance.
haven't even considered.
Yeah, this is a very dangerous problem.
Yeah.
And, some of that's unavoidable. We need to treat people who are sick with antibiotics. But one of the things that is avoidable is putting these antibiotics in animal feed, which is done to promote livestock growth.
Yeah.
It's really good for agribusiness, okay? But it's really bad because it generates superbugs. It puts more antibiotics out into the world,
Yeah.
forcing them to adapt. And then we contract these superbugs from the animals, in the slaughterhouses or from our meat products, or from drinking contaminated water. And then they jump to humans, and we have a very real crisis on our hands.
Sounds familiar. Yeah, I have not even considered the waste side of things, that we are unknowingly consuming things that would be harming us. What I wanted to add to that is I can't tell obviously when this was, but at some point in history where it crossed that point of being overboard, where, like you said, you have medical practices that were made better and increased life expectancy because you have this theory that germs or you're supposed to wash your hands, that there are bad germs out there and they could harm you. And so that's why I think there's a balance, that you have diseases and infections that were eliminated because we have been sanitary with our practices. But I don't really know at what point we went overboard. So I don't even know how we can pull it back. But one of the things that I thought about when I read this question was allergies, because I grew up in India for a bit of time. And as far as I know, the exposure there to bacteria and germs is pretty high. And then the allergy levels are also fairly low. Right. So a lot of times when people move here, they have kids that move here from other countries have no allergies or few allergies, and then over time of being in this country, they develop allergies.
Yes. And
obviously the environment has something to do with that, but I think it's also interesting that the United States is a fairly sanitary country. The environment, especially if you live in an urban setting, is very clean.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that's also part of the reason why our immune systems have not been exposed to germs that would have otherwise made us stronger, or our immune system stronger and capable of fighting infections or germs that are foreign. So, and I don't really know the answer to that question either.
Well, nobody does.
Yeah.
But you bring up a really good point, and studies have actually been done in the United States comparing rural residents, farmers, to city dwellers. And you're absolutely right about the difference in the environments and like the sterility and the concern for microbes. And being around a lot more animals obviously is going to expose you to a lot of different microbes. So studies have shown that farmers in the United States tend to generally have a more diverse microbiome.
Cool.
Opposed to the city dwellers.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, there's a strong correlation, just as you alluded to, asthma and allergies are much lower on farms than they are in the city. These dots are probably connected.
Yeah.
But you're right. We don't know exactly what picture it forms, but the correlations are striking.
Yeah. I mean, again, I don't know what the solution to that, or if there is a solution to that, but in the context of this question, I thought that is interesting, that there are some correlations out there that imply that you shouldn't be as clean in your house, or you shouldn't be as overboard with like bleaching everything down in a non-pandemic world, that you should be able to expose yourself to things that might make your immune system stronger in the longer run.
Yeah. So, I think many scientists have the adage of let your kids play in dirt.
That's exactly what I was thinking about.
Eat raw meat.
Yeah.
Or,
that's
wash your hands before you eat.
Good rule to live by. Okay, we will go back. Okay, we are going to come back to our expert guests and see what you guys have discussed. So does anyone want to share what you guys talked about, or if you have any specific ideas? Rachel will be coming around with a mic. So just raise your hand if you're interested in sharing. Yes, Jen? You brought up a lot of different great points that Bill and I talked about also in terms of the balance, because I think the conclusion we reached was that there is no right answer to which one is better, or when exactly you cross the threshold of being sanitary enough to save lives and now to sanitary to the point of detriment to our immune systems, right? Yeah, Bill, did you want to add to what Jen shared?
I think we had a very similar conversation. And I'm sorry, science doesn't have an answer yet. Scientists are debating this amongst themselves. Clearly, germs can be life-threatening and they can kill. So we do need to be mindful of them. We do need to be aware. But there's a strong case to be made for going overboard. And the studies that suggest that there's something to what we call the hygienic hypothesis, which is the idea that we may become so sanitized that we actually are depriving our body of microbes that do benefit us. There's some evidence to support this. We've talked about studies that alluded to comparing the microbiomes in people who live on farms to the microbiomes to people who live in a city. And the people who live on farms, in general, have greater diversity in their microbiomes compared to the city dwellers. And there's a strong correlation with asthma and allergies being less on the farm than in the city. Same thing with more westernized nations compared to other nations around the world that don't have that kind of infrastructure. So it's very interesting what this cause of the heightened allergies and asthma in the Western world. Is it just diet? Is it microbes? Is it both? Jury's still out on that, but the correlations are striking.
Does anyone else want to share what their group discussed or any other thoughts?
Yeah, we discussed the concept of rising allergies and asthma in correlation with oversanitation as well. We discussed that relation of allergies and asthma rising in relation to oversanitization, and we were talking about how this all seems to have one of the general themes of the book, which is that you need to consider everything in the whole as a system. Like if you're targeting one specific bacterium that's part of the system, then you could have unintended effects. We got it tied into that really well.
Yeah, we would agree. We had similar conversation about that.
Other thoughts, other ideas? No?
So one more thing we mentioned is that when we over-sanitized, and I'll bring this up for the group because Jahil was surprised, there are a lot of antibiotic residues out in the environment because of medical waste, people disposing of medication. So if you go out and test sewage or dirt, you are bound to find medicinal antibiotics out there in the wild, which is dangerous because it's generating superbugs. It's forcing bacteria out there to adapt. And that bacteria is ultimately going to find its way into animals, possibly people, and they're superbugs before we even treat them. And that's going to be a very significant problem. So another consequence of being a little too gung-ho about all of this sanitizing is putting so many antibiotics out into the wild that we're actually creating superbugs before they even infect people.
Sorry. Are there any other thoughts on this? Okay, so what I was going to add to that is that I thought that was very surprising because I had not really considered the byproducts of, people using antibiotics ending up in the world and it having an effect to that extent where it affects other people or populations in the world. So I think part of why that was surprising to me is I don't really, whenever I think about this question or ideas of people kind of taking science and what they're learning and making their own interpretations about what that means for their own lifestyle, like someone reading a paper about hand sanitizer being good for you and then using that every single day for 15 minutes or every 15 minutes can be pretty dangerous when you don't really have a scientific understanding of what that is doing. And I think this book, pretty much all of it, even though I'm a scientist, there were so many things that I had not considered or thought about. And that's a big part of what came up is how do people interpret data that's out there or information that's put out there that's meant to help the world, but kind of go too far with it. And so for Bill, I have a question that's related to something you possibly have explored a little bit, which are fads or people just kind of going too far with things like probiotic products. So just off of like a Google search, I discovered that the predicted market for probiotic products is set to exceed by $66 billion in 2024. And these are things that are just sold in Walmart, online. I have seen it quite a bit on Instagram for people who are promoting fitness products. So what I was going to ask you, considering the book shows that clearly our gut is important, the diet that we use is important, how harmful do you think it is when we turn to and use products that are not completely backed by science, or use products like probiotics as like a cure-all without really understanding what it's doing to our body?
Right, so this is an excellent question, and I think I can get through it by Thursday if I have enough time. And I'll try to be concise. And if you want to learn more about this, I did a TED Talk on it at Lancaster University. You can Google that. It's called The Second Brain, because it's about the microbiome as the gut-brain axis that Ed Yong covered in the book. But with the advent of all this knowledge, this exciting knowledge about the microbiome and how important these bugs are in our intestine, it raises some interesting questions about, can we remodel that microbiome to achieve certain health benefits or alleviate health problems? A quick and easy way to possibly do that is probiotics, right? Just swallow down some bacteria. They're usually in the form of colony-forming units, or CFUs, which gives you a rough idea as to how many bacterial cells are in that medication or that bottle, and then let them work their magic in their gut. So the whole probiotics industry, and I'm glad you Googled that, that's a surprising figure. $66 billion is almost twice as much as what the NIH gets every year to study everything that affects humans, not just infectious disease, but cancer, Alzheimer's, genetic disorders, everything. So that's really sad that people are willing to shell out that kind of money for unproven, unestablished treatments when there's investigators all over the country trying to get blood out of a stone in terms of dollars to research disease. But the probiotics industry is the Wild West. It's completely unregulated, and that's a major problem. And it gives me pause to encourage people to take these products, because we don't know what's in the bottle. There's no government oversight. These companies are not held to any kind of quality control outside of what they elect to do on their own. So there are a scattering published studies where scientists have randomly taken bottles off the shelves to see for themselves what are in these probiotics. And there are examples of nothing. They're not what they say they are, or the colony-forming units are not correct. Without any quality control, they can put anything in that bottle, and you're none the wiser, okay? So that's a big problem, and until there's some kind of regulation that is controlling what these companies claim is in their product, I would be hesitant. Now, your physician, on the other hand, can probably recommend vendors of refrigerated probiotics that are more reliable than some of the other brands that might be out there, okay? And if your physician recommends them to you, I'm not going to argue with that, because there are some studies that suggest a benefit of probiotics for certain patient populations, okay? The evidence for normal, healthy adults is not there. There's no demonstrable benefit of probiotics in normal, healthy adults. However, patients that suffer from certain GI issues like irritable bowel syndrome, possibly ulcerative colitis, may experience a modest improvement with certain formulations of probiotics. And they don't work for everybody. They might work for certain patient subsets and not others. So there might be a little trial and error that the patient has to engage in. There's also scant evidence that there might be ability of certain probiotic formulations to alleviate modestly depression. So these studies still need a long way to go, but there are a few out there that look encouraging and warrant further investigation. The other things that concern scientists about probiotics and the claims is why would they even why would your body even accept these? Because the probiotics you ingest have to survive the turmoil of the stomach. All the stomach acid has to go through, not miles, but a lot of small intestines before they even get to where they're supposed to work. That's a lot to ask of bacterial species. And whatever colony-forming units you start with, what you have at the end of the digestive system probably isn't as potent as you might think it is. So there's debate as to whether or not orally ingested probiotics can even get a foothold in the gut, if you will. The other reason we see a lot of variation outside of what may be genetics between individuals is that taking probiotics in isolation without improving gut health with diet and exercise is probably a lost cause, because bacteria, just like us, they have preferences for where they want to live. And if you're taking a probiotic in an effort to maybe help inflammation caused by what's known as leaky gut syndrome, which is a deterioration of the biofilms in the gut that lead to leaking out of substances. It sounds gross, and it is gross, but it causes health problems, and some people take probiotics to try to prevent or minimize that. But if you're putting these bugs into a person who is eating a crappy diet, there's nothing for them to nourish themselves on, okay? Those types, the beneficial bacteria that we need require fiber. High sugar, fat, and salt kill them. So you're really not doing any benefit if you're not improving your environment anyway. And if you're going to improve your diet and lifestyle, you probably won't need the probiotic. You can save yourself some money. The final thing I'll say about them is some of the potential harms. Some people might use probiotics in lieu of an established medical treatment, and that's definitely not something you should do. And there's possible side effects. Probiotics, there are some studies that suggest, at least in some people, they cause brain fog or cramps. And there are some studies, a lot of people like to take probiotics when they have antibiotics, okay? They think it'll help alleviate the stomach cramps, the GI distress that antibiotics sometimes cause. So they'll take probiotics to minimize that. For some people it might help, but there are studies that show people who do that, the microbiome has trouble bouncing back from the antibiotic treatment. So all those put together really make me hesitate to recommend probiotics for normal healthy people outside of a physician consultation.
I think we should just start a probiotics business and then turn all the money over to the NIH. I actually did not know the fact about the NIH.
If I wasn't cursed with a conscience, I really could get into a lucrative business.
Yeah, it's striking how many essentially ads I've seen on social media that promote this from people who are not scientists, people who are not even like in the business of making these. They kind of just promote it or market it from companies that have sold it to them. So I have always looked at them as harmful, but I didn't really understand how. So I just piggybacking off of what you said, and I don't know if this is already done today, but do you think that there is still room for people to take probiotics and do, healthy exercise and diet and have that be beneficial, or do you think just generally probiotics are not something you should be taking without a doctor's reference?
Yeah, I hesitate to do that because it's such an unregulated industry. And probiotics is just this huge umbrella term for hundreds of different products and formulations. So it's really difficult to give any kind of solid recommendation. Now, physicians are in a different boat because they work with all kinds of patients and they prescribed a variety of types. They may have good relationships or personal stories where they know a certain brand works very well for a certain condition. I'm not going to dispute them on that. That's their experience, and it's got an advantage over what my experience tells me. But if you're looking to improve gut health, and Ed Yong referred to this in the book as well, and you'll be hard-pressed to find a clinician or scientist to argue differently, prebiotics is probably what you should pursue. So what's the difference there? So probiotics refers to bacteria or yeast in a bottle or pill that you take. Prebiotics are the dietary ingredients, the dietary foods or beverages that foster a healthy gut. They are the food that healthy bacteria need to grow. You have to remember when you eat, you're eating for your microbiome, okay? We eat, to satisfy our appetite and our cravings. But those bacteria, if you want good bacteria in your gut, you need to give them good food. And the good bacteria love fiber, okay? And they come a la carte on fermented foods. So if you're eating sauerkraut or kimchi or pickles or yogurt, these are chock full of the very bacteria you need in your gut for a healthy microbiome. And if you continue to eat foods like that, you're supplying them with the ingredients they need to thrive. Now, if you bombard your gut with the Western diet, the sugar, the salt, the fat, excess quantities, those encourage the growth of a very narrow spectrum of bacterial species that are known to produce pro-inflammatory molecules that are just really bad for health. So if you fix up your diet, eat a lot of the prebiotic foods, and you can Google ideas for more. There's lots of them out there, and many of them are actually quite tasty. And throw a lot of fiber into your diet gradually. If you're not used to fiber, don't eat 40 grams tomorrow. You'll come to my house and slap me. Build up your fiber intake, okay? That's going to build an environment in your gut that the healthy bacteria need to thrive. And I think you'll be impressed and pleasantly surprised at how much better you feel in general.
That's really, really great. I have, I think it's a turn and talk later on that we'll bring up that touches on this in terms of like lifestyle changes, which seem to be a better option than just like a pill that will cure you. Because like you said, it's much harder to target whatever might be making you sick if it is your microbiome that's, damaged.
And you want to
because there's so much
sustain those
diversity.
changes,
Sorry?
You want to sustain those changes.
Exactly.
So it's not like a probiotic one shot and done. If you make the lifestyle changes, that's a more...
They last you for a life.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. So my turn and talk is actually touching on this, but broadening the question a little bit for you guys. And for context, on page 68, chapter 3, Yang talks about a study by a neuroscientist, Paul Patterson, where they triggered an immune response in pregnant mice and then observed the pups and their behavior after they were born. And because of seemingly altered immune systems or altered gut microbiome in the pups, they displayed abnormal behaviors like decreased communication, anxiety-like behaviors, etc. And so the hypothesis here was that it was the altered gut microbiome in the pups that was actually making them susceptible to these neurological changes and behavioral changes. And in the book, Yang also goes on to present a critique of this hypothesis, which says that you can't possibly mimic a human condition in mice, which they were trying to do by presenting this as sort of an autism-like phenotype.